So I am Joanna Everitt. I'm a professor of political science at the University of New Brunswick in St. John, and I am currently also the Dean of Arts here. Well, I think there are three things that stop them. The first is interest, the second has to do with situational and structural barriers that they face, and the third has to do with the role that political parties play. In terms of the first one, political interest, studies show that women tend to have less interest in politics than men. And there's some really legitimate reasons for why that may be. Women tend to be a lot busier, they have double work days that they're engaged in. Sometimes the policies that are being discussed are not ones that are as deemed as relevant to them as others. And so women know a lot about politics, but they know about the politics that's relevant to the lives that they lead. I think a second factor that comes into play here is the lack of role models. We still have very low representation of women in Canadian politics. At the national level, it's 26%. In New Brunswick, we're looking at 16%. And when you are a woman who might be considering politics as an option, and you look around and you say, well, the people that are in there are not really like me, or those women who are in there are excellent and strong and have to be that way, because often what happens is women think they have to be even stronger to put themselves forward for the same position a man would put them forward. You end up with this sense that, well, it's not something that's suitable for me, which is unfortunate. So I think as we get more role models in, more women in politics, others will be more interested. But I think probably the greatest barrier to women's election in engagement in political life are the political parties themselves. And political parties, despite their efforts, still tend to be dominated by men. The elites within parties are male, and often the people who are involved in making decisions about who gets selected to be candidates or recruited to be candidates are male. And so what we find is that politicians have traditionally been men. When a nominating committee is looking to find individuals who might be suitable for running, they look for people who are like those who've won in the past, and that's not often women. Tied to that is our electoral system, and the fact that our electoral system is a single-member plurality electoral system where each party is able to put one candidate forward. So there's a lot of pressure on the party to select the best candidate, or who they perceive to be the best candidate. And as a result, the competition for that position is very great, and particularly if it's a winnable riding. And what we tend to find is that in those ridings where a party is likely to win, men are more likely to be nominated. In those ridings where the party has not the same chances of winning or no chance of winning, that's where we see women nominated. So the issue is not just about getting nominated, it's where those women are being nominated. And if we take a look at New Brunswick and we look at what's happened in the past, we see that women who get involved in politics in New Brunswick have typically been elected in those swing ridings, where the party that they were running for, as a candidate for, may not have been successful in the last election, but because of a swing in the vote, they get in. And then the next election, because the vote goes a different direction, they get out. And so we find a situation where liberal women get in when there's a liberal government, and then they get dumped out when there's a conservative government. Conservative women get in when there's a conservative government, and then they get dumped out when the liberals come into office. Incumbents, or seats that have been held by incumbents, in other words, strong seats, if we look at the past records, the parties nominate men in those seats, and that's the real problem. So parties serve as really important gatekeepers that keep women out of politics. Not intentionally, I don't think, but by their actions, by the decisions, and by the fact that we have an electoral system like we do, that gives them the incentives to nominate people who they think have been successful in the past and are likely to be successful again. So when we talk about situational barriers, we're talking about things like the fact that women have greater homemaking and childcare responsibilities than men do. And this makes it more difficult. You know, again, as I noted earlier, you double work day, it means you don't often have the time to go to political meetings, to get involved, to run for political office. As well, women tend to be penalized when they run for political office with young families. It's all good and well for a man to say, look at my young family, I'm a father, I've got responsibilities, but when a woman is in that situation and she runs for office with a young family, the perception is that she's a bad mother, and that's just unfortunate. But it does present a barrier. In terms of structural barriers, we're talking about things like education, occupation, finances, time. These are the sorts of things that a candidate needs to have to be able to be perceived as being successful. And The first two that I mentioned, your occupational status and your educational status, are things where women these days have the same background as men. So they really aren't a problem for women in politics. In the past, you might not have had women in legal fields or in corporate fields, but now they're there. So we've got a pool of candidates, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be getting nominated. But what we do find is that women often don't have the same financial resources that men do. Men are more willing to go out and ask people to support them financially in their election campaigns, and women are a little bit more hesitant, and they often don't have the networks with those deep pockets. As well, as I noted earlier, they don't often have the time because they've got these other responsibilities that take on, and even though men are becoming more involved in homes and child rearing, studies still show that women are carrying the brunt of that load. So those are barriers that are there, not as serious as they were in the past, but still important challenges that women face. One of the other challenges that women tend to face in politics is the way that they get covered by the media. And a lot of my research has looked at how media represent female politicians and the stereotypes that end up getting used and the impact that those stereotypes tend to have on how we as voters then end up perceiving women. So what we find is that they tend to focus on female candidates or politicians' appearance, their families, and less on their policy and the things that they're running for. We find that they tend to frame women as political outsiders, emphasizing behaviors that are breaking with expectations, presenting them as being much more assertive and aggressive than they tend to be. And we, as voters, hold these unconscious stereotypes and biases as well. And so when we see that, we become more critical of those female candidates than we might be if we saw the same coverage of a male candidate. So the media also plays a role. It's not intentional, but it's there, and it's one of the additional challenges that women face. Well, I think there are a number of things that can be done. One, organizations such as Equal Voice or Women for 50% can encourage more women to run, can provide training opportunities for them, information about what it is that they're getting into and how they go about getting elected, and I think that's an important part of it. Two, I think that we can put pressure on political parties to do more to recruit women, to think about women. And again, I think they try, but they don't recognize that some of the structures that they have make it less likely that women will stand forward or be identified and selected in ridings where they're more likely to win. I think one of the really exciting things that has happened in New Brunswick in the past year that has real potential, if the parties sort of pick up on it, is the fact that we now have legislation that provides incentives to political parties to nominate women. So we have campaign expenses whereby candidates get a certain amount of their campaign expenses reimbursed to them at the end of the election, depending upon whether they get a certain number of votes or how many votes they get. And the government last spring actually changed that such that women candidates get a slightly higher percentage of reimbursement than the male candidates do. And the result is that a party, if they really wanted to be more financially viable, would strategically go out and recruit women in winnable ridings because then they'd get more money. And I think that is that's one of the policies that feminist academics have been advocating for since the early 1990s. We are the first jurisdiction in Canada to actually enact that legislation. It's been sort of raised at various times, provincially and federally, but New Brunswick is the first jurisdiction to enact that legislation. And I think that has real potential to change the mindset, to provide incentives to parties to be more active in recruiting women, particularly in winnable ridings. The public does not discriminate. If you run a woman in a riding where her party is likely to win, that woman is as likely to win as the man is. So there's no discrimination against a candidate based on their gender. Where the challenge really lies and where the parties select their candidates and where they nominate them. And as I've noted, in the past, the parties have tended to nominate them in non-winnable or swing ridings and not in those ridings where they're most likely to win. I think the main thing that comes with more women in politics is that you have a diversity of views that are being raised, presented, and considered when decisions are being made. There's a lot of information that shows that When you've got a board with more women or minorities on it, you're going to have better outcomes. And that goes for politics as well. And so by having women or others who are not traditionally involved in political decision making engaged in those decisions, you're going to have outcomes from the legislation, policies that will be better suited for the needs of the diversity of the Canadian population.